don't have that issue. Thank you so much.
So today I'll be speaking for about 25 minutes, something like that, talking about the Shoah and anti-Semitism, and specifically trying to compare the response to the Shoah during the Shoah to what is occurring today. Not that the two are the same. There's much discussion whether what we're seeing is the new 1930s. I think it's very serious today, but I don't think it's the same. But that depends upon who you ask and what you feel within your heart and soul. And I'd like to speak very personally today and then open it up. Wish to begin with a beautiful video that was done about my uncle, Yecheskel. My father, as you may know, was the 9th child of 10 children, and his younger sister, the 10th, was Ella Willig, who is the mother of Rabbi Mordechai Willig, and wonderful children, David Willig and Chavi Willig, Tammy. And Chavi was a hero in her time. She wrote a book called Notwithstanding. She was stricken with polio as a little child, and she lived a heroic life. She recently passed away. And this family, they're very talented, did a beautiful video about Yecheskel, who was my father's and Ella's older brother, and Yom HaShoah was yesterday. So we're going to begin by showing this video. I hope you'll find it of meaning. I found it very touching. It lasts for almost 5 minutes, and then I'll step in.
Let me tell you the story of Chatzkel Weiss. He was my great uncle. He was my hero. He died before I was born, but I've heard a lot about him.
So my mother's brother, Yecheskel Shraga, who was known as Chatzkel, aside from being a budding Talmud Chacham, was also an excellent soccer player. He would play soccer not only with his Jewish friends, but even with the non-Jewish Poles who lived in their small town of Ostrienchin. Uncle Chatzkel was one of 10 children.
Uncle Chatzkel was very musical, and everybody knew that he was an unbelievably strong person, even as a teenager.
Once my grandfather, Reb David HaKohen Weiss, father of Uncle Chatzkel, was walking near his hometown, and a bunch of thugs, gangsters, started up with him. They were taunting him, they were teasing him, they were threatening him. He felt very concerned. Suddenly, one of the gangsters recognized him as Uncle Chatzkel's father. They said, "We can't touch him. We can't bother him." Every Erev Shabbos, for the Armalite, for the poor people in the community, he gives out zwei bulkelach, 2 challah and 2 candles, lichtelach, for the aniyim that come to Shabbos Kodesh.
In the ghetto and in the concentration camps he was in, he would do anything for anybody to help them in any way possible. After the war, my uncle came to America. He worked hard, very hard, and he became a successful banker.
And he always wanted to make Aliyah.
Chatzkel was the gabbai in his shul, and everybody loved him. He would give tzedakah with a smile to anyone who approached him. That's how he was. Chatzkel loved to daven. His relationship with Hashem was genuine, and it was something that was important to him. The highlight of his year was blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah.
Growing up, hearing stories about Uncle Chatzkel, I've always been inspired about his zest for learning.
With his financial success, Chatzkel lent money to many people, survivors, to help them start businesses in America. He loved his community. Every summer, he would throw a huge barbecue in his backyard and invite everybody. It was the place to be. For his 70th birthday, he commissioned the writing of a beautiful Sefer Torah. Chatzkel had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. All of them are professionals who are involved very, very heavily in their communities, in their shuls, in their schools, a large part due to their father's role model. Finally, at the end of his life, Chatzkel made Aliyah. He lived his dream. In his will, he left $3 million to start a new yeshiva. What better way to perpetuate his life, dedicated to the Jewish people and Torah? But there's one thing.
But just one thing.
But just one thing.
But just one thing.
But just one thing.
Just one thing.
Just one thing. Just one thing. Just one thing. Just one thing.
There's one thing.
Just one thing.
Chatzkel, his wife, and 3 children were all murdered by the Nazis.
My mother always said that she is sure when the Nazis came to kill Uncle Chatzkel, she knows he didn't go down without a fight.
I was privileged to be named after him.
I grew up in a home where certainly in my teen years, there was much discussion about Chatzkel, about 2 of his siblings who were also murdered. And indeed, in 1959, only 14 years after the war, my father, Rabbi Dr. Moshe Weiss, was one of the first Jews to return to Poland. I have little doubt that he really returned in the hope that maybe he would find Chatzkel alive. But of course, he didn't. And I have memories of the stories my father came back with. One story will always remain with me until my last breath. Standing in the Auschwitz camp, in the place where my father grew up. My father grew up in the town of Oświęcim. In fact, my father wrote a wonderful book that is widely read, certainly by people visiting Poland, called From Oświęcim, which is the Polish pronunciation of the city, to Auschwitz, which is the German pronunciation of the city. And my father said that he was visiting during the winter, and his guide said to my Abba, "Too bad you're here during the winter because the grass in Auschwitz is especially beautiful." And my father said, "What makes it so beautiful? We've all seen grass. Manishtano, why is the grass in Auschwitz any different?" And he said, "Because the grass in Auschwitz is not just green, it's blue, because it was fed by special fertilizers, the remains from the bodies, from the ashes of human beings, of Jews." This guide obviously did not know that my father was Jewish, let alone that he was a rabbi. I grew up hearing these stories, and it implanted within me something very deep that only in hindsight, many years later, am I able to recognize. And that is, along with many others in my generation, born at the tail end of the Shoah, a fierce commitment that this would never happen again. I, like so many, had questions even as a young man. The deepest question we would ask is why? Why and how could God have allowed 6 million to die? And the older I get, the more imponderable, the more inexplicable, the more I understand that this question has no answer. And while the Talmud says that when we come to the heavens, we are going to be asked certain questions, I believe we have a right at that point to say, "Permit me, O God, I have some questions. Why? How could you have allowed 6 million to perish?" I don't have the answer. I believe there is no answer that human beings can properly comprehend. But I've come to understand that along with the question that we have a right to ask, and that is, where was God? We should be open to hearing another question. And that question is, where was man? Where was woman? Where was humankind? I'm thinking of the ship St. Louis, that image of the St. Louis, which I read about early on in my life, is an image that has always remained with me. A German vessel in 1939, full of Jews crossing the Atlantic, ultimately docking off a harbor in Miami. Jews desperate for a free haven, and nothing. One or two were permitted to disembark, but the others remained on board. And as a young man, I was driven by that image, and I wondered, as this was occurring, what was the response of the Jewish community? And looking into that question and researching minutes of meetings of Jewish organizations and Hillels on campus, or Jewish organizations on campus, pre-Hillel perhaps, what I found was that there was, by and large, silence. Even though the plight of the St. Louis was in the papers, maybe buried, but it was in the papers. Everyone knew about it. No one could say we did not know. Even as everyone knew, the response was silence. And the then president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom my grandmother, my bubby, venerated, she used to call him Rosenberg. Well, he was no Rosenberg. He, with the stroke of a pen, could have saved all of those lives, but he didn't. And one of the reasons that he didn't is because he wasn't pressured by the Jewish community and others of moral conscience. We cannot expect a president to do what we ourselves are not demanding him to do. And so in my book on leadership and activism called Spiritual Activism, a book that was written almost 25 years ago, which I've been looking at lately. I generally don't look at my own writings, but I've been looking at, and normally a book like that has a very short shelf life, but that book still resonates to this day. And in the very first chapter, I asked this question: why do we engage in spiritual activism? And the subheading is a partnership between God and humankind. And here are the first few paragraphs. The image that has most defined my activism is that of the SS St. Louis in 1939, packed with almost 1,000 Jews. The vessel slowly made its way from Germany across the Atlantic, docking just off the coast of Florida. The ship's passengers were desperate to come ashore and be free from the Nazi regime. It was not to be. US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt refused to allow the passengers to disembark. In the end, the boat was forced to return to Europe, where many of those aboard met their death during the Holocaust. Although the plight of St. Louis was widely reported in the press, American Jewry did not do its share to help. Instead of action, there was a deafening silence. No Jewish organization during those dark days dared to petition President Roosevelt to open America's doors. Not surprisingly, the doors weren't opened. After all, we cannot expect the president to act if we do not demand action. From my earliest days in the rabbinate, I have heard people ask how one can believe in a God who permitted the deaths of 6 million Jews. As I grow older, this question becomes more difficult, even impossible to answer. But the story of the St. Louis teaches us that there is a flip side to the question, where was God? We also need to ask, where was humankind? God did not build Auschwitz. People did. And God was not responsible for the deafening silence in the free world as the devastation continued. Humankind stood by and did nothing. In fact, Holocaust survivors have told me that they believe it wasn't the enemy who broke the back of European Jewry, but rather the silence of those who could have done more to help. While the persecution by the enemy could have been overcome, the silence of one's own people was insurmountable. The idea that we must always ask ourselves if we are doing our share is steeped in Jewish sources. And so I began this humble volume on spiritual activism. And many who are on this video are dear, dear friends with whom I grew up. When we say I grew up, we think of being a child growing up. Well, I came to the community with Toby when I was a very, very young man. I wasn't 29 years old. I was 28 years old, young. And many on this video, we know each other for 50 years and we grew up. In our adult lives, one can also grow up. And activism became a cornerstone of the Bayit. It wasn't a postscript. It was built into the very fabric of what the Bayit is all about. From the very beginning, when we were looking for more people to join us, the synagogue was advertised, amongst other things, as a place of Jewish activism. And the synagogue, like its rabbi, was a never again synagogue. And wherever there was anti-Semitism, we tried to join others in raising a voice of Jewish conscience, of moral conscience. And over the years, there were serious struggles. Certainly the Soviet Union and communism that basically held 3 million Jews hostage was an anti-Semitic government, was an anti-Semitic country. That certainly is the case. Certainly it's the case that Arab countries, Libya and Iraq and Iran and those countries that expelled Jews, almost 1 million Jews in 1948, anti-Semitism was omnipresent in those countries. In America and in the West, it was different. Anti-Semitism was by and large under control. That doesn't mean that we didn't have our moments when we faced serious anti-Semitic challenges. There were individuals who rose on the scene who were anti-Semites to the anti-Semitic power. Farrakhan, who's an anti-Semite. David Duke. I had the great honor to shove a sign into his face when he announced for the presidency, and the sign read, "Duke is the Nazi of the 90s. He was a real anti-Semite. So was Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan was one of the most threatening anti-Semites because, having come to know him, he was a smart man. He wrote well. He was a syndicated columnist. More than Duke, his voice was heard as a rational voice, and yet he was an anti-Semite. And yes, Yankel Rosenbaum, a Chabad scholar who was murdered in 1991 for one reason: he was a Jew. And the Bayit became so involved in that cause. At that time, and please excuse me for using the first person singular, I know more than anyone how little I have done over the years, but there was something in me. It didn't come from the head, it came from the heart that said, a Jew was murdered because he was a Jew? We dare not be silent. And so we joined in the effort. We joined in protesting against the then mayor of the city of New York, David Dinkins, whom I voted for. I have very strong feelings, as you know, about our Black brothers and sisters, and I saw in him a hope. And yet the way he conducted himself was so very disappointing. He never assumed responsibility when allowing the police to vent, as in fact was discovered in reports when there was research done about his conduct during those very, very difficult times. And it's probably for that reason, in no small measure, that when he ran for re-election in New York in 1994, he was defeated by Rudy Giuliani. I'd come a long way. When Dinkins became mayor, our Bayit was protesting outside because he had invited Tutu to be his guest speaker, and Tutu had just compared Nazi treatment of Jews to the IDF's treatment of Palestinians. And we stood outside and we protested. That was our sacred, sacred responsibility. And by the time Giuliani became the mayor, he invited me to come to the inauguration. And those are settings, as many of you know, I'm very, very uncomfortable in, but I felt he invited me, I should go. And I sat in the second row right behind Ed Koch. And I've written about this for the forward. And my last line went something like, I thought back to 4 years ago when I was protesting outside. And here I was sitting in a place of honor. I would have given anything not to have had to protest and not to sit in that second row as Giuliani took his oath of office. We had our moments of anti-Semitism, and I'm sure those listening can think of others. But in the West, it was not endemic. Anti-Semitism was not all-consuming. And over the years, I've come to understand that I grew up in my younger years when I didn't get it, and in my adult years when I could get it, that I lived a honeymoon life. Basically, we lived in a country where there was no anti-Semitism on an all-inclusive level. It wasn't there because it was stymied by the Shoah. This is certainly true in the first 15, 25 years after the Shoah. It's certainly the case. Even virulent anti-Semites, and not that there weren't, there were, but even virulent anti-Semitism, it just wasn't the thing to do after 6 million Jews were murdered. I would use the word, and I'm hesitant to use it, that the 6 million who even couldn't speak for themselves because their lives were so brutally taken, in a certain sense, their memory protected all of us. I would say it in a very direct way. We in the free world who failed to protect them, they, after their death, in a certain sense, they protected us. And as we went on, we did everything we can to keep Shoah memory alive. Maybe even we overdid it, because the Shoah is part of Judaism, not the other way around. And for many Jews, Judaism and Torah became part of the Shoah. But the Holocaust Museum, which is funded by the United States government to the tune of many tens of millions of dollars a year, we did all we could to keep that memory alive as we screamed from the rooftops and barricades when necessary. Never again. Never again. And we began to see cracks when people, good people who should have known better, made terrible mistakes. And they perverted Shoah memory. Like when Reagan went to Bitburg in May of 1985, and he compared the SS Waffen to the Jewish victims. Or when Pope John Paul II embraced Kurt Waldheim. And it was then that the Bayit felt we couldn't be bystanders again. We had to be there. to be there to protest against Reagan in Germany, to be schlepped out of that Bergen-Belsen documentation center, to follow Kurt Waldheim all over the world, a man who was called by Pope John Paul II a Prince of Peace. A Prince of Peace. Imagine that. Still yet it was under check. Under check. It wasn't endemic. But today things are different. We are 80 years after the Shoah. And I said this to you recently and wrote about it in a CNN piece. Things are different today. The anti-Semites are coming out of the walls. Those who are beneath the surface are beginning to surface because the Shoah is in the rear view mirror. The Shoah today, for most of the world, is a footnote in history. Most of the world that may have for decades wanted to forget, but we didn't permit it to forget. Now, the world today, by and large, doesn't want to hear about the Shoah. And it's up to us, if the world wishes to forget, to proclaim, we will not allow you to forget. And that, I think, has contributed to the anti-Semitism today, which has become endemic. That doesn't mean that there aren't other reasons. Of course there are other reasons. Anti-Semitism has gone through different shapes. There was an anti-Semitism of a Hitler Yamach Shemo V'Zichro, whose goal was to murder Jews for only one reason. They were Jews. And then there was an anti-Semitism like the Catholic Church over 1,500 years, as Rael Hilberg writes in The Destruction of European Jewry. He writes that the Catholic Church was involved in the deepest horrors of anti-Semitism. That was an anti-Semitism of ideology. The Catholic Church said, we're not interested in murdering Jews. We only want the Jews to alter their faith. Believers in Torah should become believers in Jesus. If you believe in Jesus, you're going to be embraced and you're going to be accepted. That was an anti-Semitism that was directed at our ideology. And as a matter of fact, I think over the years, because of the great work of some interfaith spiritual leaders on our side and on the Catholic and on the Christian side, great advances have been made. When one thinks about John the 23rd and all of his proclamations, as one who has protested the Pope eye to eye, it must be said, great advances have been made. That was the anti-Semitism directed at Jews because of ideology, because of our religion. And today, the new anti-Semitism, of course, is anti-Zionism. I say it in an unyielding way. Anyone who proclaims that Israel does not have a legitimate right to have a state, that is not just anti-Zionism. That is anti-Jewishness. That is anti-Semitism. One could disagree with a Zionist government, but if one says we have no right to the state, that's the real deal. So there are many reasons why anti-Semitism is flourishing, and flourishing is probably not the right term. It's too positive a word. But there are many reasons why it's spread everywhere, as I've just pointed out, and Israel is certainly part of that equation. That's why I took such exception with my grandson when we wrote that critique of the United States government's plan to fight anti-Semitism. But when one looked at through that 62-page report, the word Zionism didn't appear once in that report. How could you write a report about fighting anti-Semitism without mentioning the word Zionism even once. I'm thinking of doing another piece. It's been a year since that report has been released, and the piece will be called, How Are We Doing? We're not doing too well. You can't talk about anti-Semitism today without talking about anti-Zionism. Having said all that, in life, it's very often the case that we don't do things. Things don't happen because of one reason. There could be many reasons. But I stand firm on the belief that one of the reasons that anti-Semitism is endemic is because the Shoah is fading in history. The Shoah is fading in memory. And so let's take a look at the first few paragraphs that I wrote in that piece in CNN. Approaching my 80th birthday, I realized that as a Jew, I've lived a honeymoon life. Born at the tail end of World War II, I grew up with anti-Semitism by and large under control, as even vicious Jew haters were reticent to attack Jews. Shuli, could you read the next sentence, which I don't have?
To some extent, I believe the world's guilt over either its complicity or inactivity, as 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, silenced the enemies of our people. This doesn't mean anti-Semitism was not a serious problem, especially in recent decades. There were vicious anti-Semites and horrific anti-Semitic incidents that had to be condemned. The likes of Louis Farrakhan and David Duke needed to be confronted head-on. Events like the 1991 murder of Yankele Rosenbaum, a Hasidic Lubavitch scholar, stabbed to death by a Jew-hating mob, brought fear into the hearts and souls of the Jewish community. Still, anti-Semitism was not endemic. 8 decades after the Holocaust, however, the Shoah is in the rearview mirror. For much of the world, it is a footnote in history. Its memory no longer stymies anti-Semites who were always hiding in the shadows and have now surfaced with fury.
Which brings me to the present. And specifically, I want to focus on anti-Semitism on the campuses. I'm very proud that Chovevei Torah and Yeshivat Maharat, if I can say anecdotally, you can see I'm like a Zaidi Shepi Nachas. By next June, there will be 100 Orthodox women with smicha. And Chovevei Torah is reaching 160 rabbis in the field. And when I consider the rabbis who served at the Bayit, whom many of you know very well, Rabbi Schwartzberg and Rabbi Martyr and Rabbi Kanevsky and Rabbi Gelman and Rabbi Hertzfeld and Rabbi Starr and Rabbi Frank and Rabbi Mintz and Rabbi Sonner. It goes on and on and on. We're almost 300 rabbis in what I still call the modern and open Orthodox community, and many are serving on campuses. Many are the CEOs of Hillels. It reads like a who's who. They have served at Cornell, at Harvard, at Brown, at Penn, not bad, at Brandeis, at Tufts, at MIT, at UCLA, at Stanford, and it goes on and on and on. Even Hofstra and Temple and Muhlenberg, University of Toronto. Ben Berger is serving as one of the key players in National Hillel. I visited many of these campuses over the years, now not as much, but I know something about these campuses and want to react to what's happening. And I want to talk about it in the back of my mind is what occurred during the Shoah. But again, I want to underscore, I don't believe what's happening now is the 30s yet. In the 30s, you didn't have German police stepping in and intervening for Jews. Unfortunately, they're stepping in, for my liking, much too late on campuses. But having said that, still yet there are key government leaders, Eric Adams and others, who have stepped in, and the police are still protecting, by and large, they are protecting the Jewish community. But I'd like, with that silence of 80 years ago, to kind of look at what's happening on the campuses today and see, have we been true to our clarion call of never again? In other words, I'm looking for a report card. How have we done in the face of all that's unfolding? And this is the key of what I wanted to leave with you today. It's really the tale of two cities. On the one hand, I think one can paint a picture that this is the worst of times that we as Jews have experienced in America. And there's a lot of truth to that. With all of these encampments, tragically, there are universities that have capitulated to their outrageous demands. And so, for example, Brown University. Brown is a university that negotiated, and the encampments, I think, have ended, but with the understanding that Brown will now consider divestment from Israel. And that seems to be spreading. What Columbia did in canceling its larger graduation is a terrible mistake. I'm telling you, as one who fought anti-Semitism in the field, the more you buckle, the more you capitulate the anti-Semites, not the more they're appeased, the more they want. And the more one speaks out against anti-Semitism, the more the community, the more the university is protected. And so there is a negative story to what's occurred. And it pains me. If one Jew is standing in those encampments, and there are those who claim that, I think that this number is way out of whack, that as many as 20% of Jews on universities are in those encampments, I think that's way, way, way too much. I don't think there are 20% of the campuses that are involved one way or the other in all of this. I would say it's 5 to 10%, but that is anecdotal. That's a guess. The truth is, I don't know. I just don't know. But it's sad. It's sad when we see chevra, some of them who have day school education, some who went to yeshivot, who are out there. And there is real concern that there are other young Jewish students who are kind of parav. They don't have an opinion one way or the other. They're going to be swept up by these pro-Palestinian, I dare say. I don't mind if you're pro and sympathetic for innocent, truly innocent Palestinians and Palestinian children who have tragically been killed in the crossfire. But standing up for Hamas, wearing Hamas headbands, women saying, I am Hamas, I am Hamas, gays speaking out against Israel, speaking out for Hamas, go to Gaza, how long will you have to live? There is concern, however, that the Jews in the middle will be swept up because they don't want to be disenfranchised. Certainly progressive Jews and progressive Orthodox Jews like myself. I don't like the word progressive, but I am certainly in the liberal camp when it comes to women's rights and feminism, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to civil rights, when it comes to LGBT. But as our wonderful Congressman Richie Torres, whom I've renamed Richie Torah. I care about him. He's the real deal. He's the best I've ever seen in government. He says, I support Israel not despite being a progressive, but because I am a progressive. And what intersectionality has taught us, that these students understand that if they are progressive, that they're only going to be welcomed into that progressive community if they're anti-Israel. Basically, the narrative that's being presented is that this world has the oppressors and the oppressed, the colonized and the colonialists. And Israel has been put into the group of oppressors. How about that? Oppressors. We are the colonialists. My goodness, if there's any indigenous population that is native all the way back, even before the Indians in America, it's Israel. It's the Jews entering into Israel in the time of Joshua. So there is concern that there are Jews who really don't have an opinion one of the way will join those ranks because they don't want to be discarded. You can't be part of an LGBT university community or environment university community or a Roe v. Wade community and all of that. You can't be part of that community if you're pro-Israel. You can't be part of that community. You have to be anti-Israel to be in that community. And that's the negative tale. That's the tale, and that's the story, that it's bad and getting worse. But I want to leave you with this. My dear, dear friends, our reaction is different than that reaction of silence during the Shoah. I remember during the Soviet Jewry movement, that was a people's movement. That was a young person's movement. It started when the great Jacob Birnbaum of blessed memory and Yibadel Chaim Arukim Glenn Richter, one of the righteous tzaddikim of our time, they stood up and they said, never again. And young people led the way. And in 1991, when communism fell, who would have ever dreamt that 2 million, 2.5 million Jews, 2 million Jews would leave the Soviet Union? There are just a couple hundred, not just, but few hundred thousand still there. They should leave today. They should have left yesterday. We wondered, will there be a comparable movement? The freedom of Soviet Jewry was one of the greatest achievements of the American Jewish community. We were junior partners, as I write in my book, Open Up the Iron Door. The real heroes were the Sharonskys, the Mendeleviches, the Beguns, the Kochebayevskys, the Ida Nudels. They were the heroes because when they protested, they went to prison. That's when we went to prison. What was it? A day, 2 days, 2 weeks in a light kind of prison. They were the heroes. It was a real powerful movement. And we wondered, will there ever be another movement that's going to galvanize our community? So I'd like to share with you, as I approach my 80th birthday, and look back on a life of a rabbi activist and never again activist. There's much to be concerned about, but I'm so hopeful. I am seeing today the Jewish community, and especially the young Jewish community, responding beautifully. Yes, I'm seeing on synagogues all over the country, there are signs that say, this is the 210th day of the hostages being in those tunnels. The 211th day. I haven't seen those signs since we put up similar signs when Sharansky was in prison. This is the second Shabbat, the 100th Shabbat that he's still in prison. In Riverdale, every Sunday, kids from Lefel, from Heschel, joined by SAR kids, Kinneret kids, synagogues, rabbis, every Sunday they march. And it's not just here in Riverdale, it's all over the country. And Hillel rabbis are reporting, and they're very concerned. There are students there who are frightened. They're reporting that there is more attendance at their Shabbat meals, at their programs. Chabad is saying this than ever before. That's not unusual. It's not unusual for Jews who weren't identified to become identified in response to threats of anti-Semitism. It's very, very, very common for that to occur. When we think about the Soviet Jewry movement, what was it? It was a response to the anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. When we think of the Herzl Zionist movement, what was that about? It was a response to what was unfolding, the Dreyfus case, the anti-Semitism. That foundationally is what Israel was all about. That's why one of the first laws introduced by the Knesset was a religious statement of never again, of the law of return. Jews who were always turned away would always have a place to go. And there would be an army that would protect us. And I know October 7th happened. Where was the army? But there's a difference. I don't know why what happened, and that has to be found out. But now our army is knocking on the doors of Rafah. It's a different time. So there's a response. There's a response to the anti-Semitism. And the response is Jews become identified. I remember Lou Faber of blessed memory, wonderful man. He became involved in Amcha. I went to see him. I needed a little financial help. And he was looking at a screen. I said, Lou, I need your help. You're looking at a screen. He said, I just looked at my screen and I see I just made $25,000. I'll give it to you, to Amcha. To fight for Jewish rights. I said, keep looking at your screen. Keep looking at your screen. And if you remember about 22 years ago, Istanbul was victimized. And of course, we know who leads Istanbul, a real anti-Semite these days. But there was a terrorist bombing and synagogues were destroyed and many people were killed. And so Lou Faber calls me and he says to me, Avi, I know you're going to go to Turkey. Let me go with you so you can go like a mensch. You'll be in a hotel. You don't have to be in a one-star hotel. You'll have some decent food. You're not going to eat out of bean cans and salami. And you know what? I'll get a car. We'll take us around. I go, okay, Lou, if you want to come, bivakasha. I said, by the way, the car, make sure it's unobtrusive. Nobody should notice because, we don't want to be noticed. We're at the airport. We're waiting for the car. I say, Lou, where's the car? And suddenly it shows up, my dear Lou Faber. He had leased a stretch limousine. We're going to be very unnoticed. And it was pink, a pink stretch limousine. And we did what we had to do. All the synagogues closed, and we tried to give some comfort and organize prayer services in the chief rabbi's home, Rabbi Aleva. And then we heard that there was one synagogue, the Euphrates divides the European side from the Asian side deep into Asia where they were having services. So we went to an early morning service. They asked me to say a few words. I got up and I was speaking words of hope. And I turned to the right and I see my Lou Faber, who had told me he wants to have nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with observance. He just wanted to make sure that the Jewish nation, the Jewish peoplehood was strong, would fight anti-Semitism. I looked to the right, and he's in tefillin. His tefillin, the headpiece was on his nose. The shel yad, his hand was on his palm instead of on his inner bicep. I said, Lou, excuse the language, what the hell are you doing? You're in tefillin. And he said to me, those bastards tell me I can't put on tefillin. I'm putting on tefillin. We're seeing that now. We're seeing Jews responding. And yes, there's much to be concerned about and much to be critical about. I know when when we open this up, there will be people who will say, but. I'm looking at it more positively now. I think the Jewish community understands that never again is now. And I actually believe that now is what's called an Eit HaKosher. Now is the time for the Hillel rabbis on campus, for rabbis in synagogues, to turn this interest in defending Jews from being a reactive Judaism to a proactive Judaism. If I am a Jew only to fight anti-Semitism, that is negative Judaism. That's reactive Judaism. And reactive Judaism cannot endure. What one must do is transform reactive Judaism into proactive Judaism. If it's proactive, that's a Judaism that will endure. What Edgar Bronfman told me happened when he went to visit Rabbi Soloveitchik when he became the president of the World Jewish Congress, Edgar of blessed memory, with whom I enjoyed a wonderful relationship after I had been very publicly critical of him during the Soviet Jewry movement, but we became very, very dear, dear friends. He said that he went to see Rabbi Soloveitchik, and Rabbi Soloveitchik said, well, what's your mission? He said, we fight anti-Semitism. And he said, he'll never forget that Rabbi Soloveitchik said to him, just remember, you were not only born a Jew to fight anti-Semitism. You were not only born a Jew to fight anti-Semitism. And that's what I wrote also in my book on spiritual activism. So let's take a look at that paragraph. It's a paragraph after talking about our responsibility to fight anti-Semites. And by the way, in my lifetime, I have found that orphan Jews are afraid to fight anti-Semitism. There's a fear. If you fight anti-Semitism, there's a fear it's going to bring too much attention to ourselves. When in fact, the opposite is correct. The more we stand up, the more we're protected, more than rendered vulnerable. And so it's really a cornerstone that Jews stand up against anti-Semitism. But once a Jew identifies for that reason, it's critical it be turned into something proactive. And so I wrote, the second task after the task of standing up against anti-Semites is to recognize that the essence of spiritual activism is to ignite the Jewish spark within each of us. I think it's lower down, Shuli. It's the last paragraph of page 36. The second task is to recognize that the essence of spiritual activism is to ignite the Jewish spark within each of us. The activist who is grounded exclusively in physical defense, demonstrations, rallies, protests, political lobbying, doesn't understand the higher purpose of activism. If I am a Jew only to fight anti-Semitism, that is negative Judaism. If, however, I am a Jew because I appreciate the Sabbath, I treasure the Jewish laws and rituals that ennoble the life of the Jew, and I devote time to reading Jewish books and to Torah study, I would add, and I support the state of Israel, that is positive Judaism. Negative Judaism will not endure. Positive Judaism will. And so I close in saying that Yom HaShoah was a time when we reacted by and large in a helpless way. We had lost all hope. As Ezekiel the prophet says in his prophecy over the valley of the dry bones, and he says, the dry bones, He was the prophet of the destruction of the first temple in Babylonia after the exile. Our hope is all lost. When I think about those times compared to now, I'm very hopeful. That doesn't mean I'm not concerned. I'm deeply concerned. And every one of those encampments upset me to the core. I keep thinking what I would be doing if I were 10 years, 20 years younger. It upsets me to the core. But having said that, I'm hopeful. And I think we all should think about being hopeful. How does one become hopeful? After all, hope is an emotion. It's a feeling. How do you control the feeling? A feeling just is. It's not right. It's not wrong. It is. Feeling is a feeling. It's a feeling. I'm a behaviorist in my psychology of life. The way to feel hopeful is to talk hope, to do hope, to act hopefully, whatever we're feeling, to see the hope. And I implore you, no matter our age, not to be bystanders who are silent. Everyone in their own way, however we do it, you can find the way. I can find the way to try to make a difference and to turn lo avdatikvatenu into lo avdatikvatenu. Our hope is not lost. And so just for a moment, let's listen to the Hatikvah and then we'll open it up.
נפש יהודי הומייה ופאתי מזרח מדהימה עין לציון צופיה עוד לא אבדה תקוותנו
Listening to that tikvah, I'm thinking now not only of the response of the young voices here in America, but in Israel. I'm going to Israel alone tomorrow. I just can't live with myself if I'm not there for this Yom HaZikaron and Chag HaAtzmaut. How the young people in Israel across the religious spectrum, across the political spectrum, have responded. Yeah, during the rallies against judicial reform, there were many pilots who said they're not going to fly, but when this occurred, how they've flown. They've saved Israel. To listen to my grandson, Gavi, who enlisted just 2 weeks ago, I say, Gavi, do you have to be a fighter? And he says, that's my responsibility to do my share. I want to live, but I'm going to give it all. That's why I wear 2 of these necklaces, one for the hostages, and the other is the dog tag of my Rebbe. He really is my hero, Gilad, our eldest grandson who entered into the army. We have a lot to be proud of, a lot to be optimistic about, a lot to be hopeful for. Od lo avda tikvatenu, atikva bat alpayim, liot amchavshi bartzenu. And yes, if I were asked now about the future of American Jewry, and we owe a lot to America, I believe in offering Thanksgiving, Hakarat Tov. I'm not sure of the future here, but I am sure of the future, God willing, in Israel. Liyotam Chavshi Bartzenu Be'eretz Tzion Yerushalayim. I spoke for a long time